The first thing I wanted to do was thank you very much for accepting our invitation to Western and accepting our invitation to speak on our podcast. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind giving us a little background information about yourself.
Okay. First, thank you very much for the invitation. As we said in an email exchange, I never turn down invitations from graduate students.
We appreciate that.
I've turned down invitations to deliver the Medieval Academy lecture at Leeds 2 years running now, but I never turn on graduate students. Background, let's see. I'm Geraldine Heng. I founded and direct the Global Middle Ages Project and the Mapamundi Digital Initiatives. This is something that began as a teaching experiment in spring 2004 at the University of Texas. But it's taken off, you know. There's a Global Middle Ages in lots of places now. In the UK, there are MA and PhD programs on the Global Middle Ages at Birmingham and at Edinburgh. Oxford historians have their own research initiative on the Global Middle Ages. In the US, University of California has given a large collaborative grant to historians at Berkeley, Santa Barbara, and Davis for workshops, research, teaching, and they're going to have their own journal at the University of California Press called Journal of Medieval Worlds. Connecticut and Pennsylvania now have programs on the Global Middle Ages as well. This is something that's really taken off. As a medievalist, I teach a variety of things. I teach kind of like what I think of as a fun Middle Ages. So I've taught Robin Hood and Joan of Arc and outlaws and out of law, medieval biography from Augustine onwards. I've taught the Crusades. I taught the Crusades first in the fall of 1994. But 2 weeks ago, I heard Brian Kaplos talk about the Crusades, the kind of Crusades that he teaches. I'm never going to teach the Crusades again. This is a state of the art. Right now, this is what we do, kind of multimedia Crusades. I've taught the Global Middle Ages. I've taught travel literature. I've taught Chaucer. I've taught Arthurian romance, medieval romance. I've taught race in the Middle Ages, European Middle Ages, all sorts of things. My first book, Empire of Magic, Medieval Romance and the Politics of Cultural Fantasy, came out in 2003 and 2004 and 2012. And then it took me 12 years to produce the next book, The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages. This is 7 chapters long, more than 500 words, more than 500 pages in print. In a large format. My editor always reminds me, don't forget it's a large format. It's 10 by 7 rather than the usual 9 by 6. And it is nearly 90,000 words. The average book is 125,000 words. So it's a big book. It took a long time to write. And it took a long time because I was in conversation with critical race theorists as well as with medievalists to convince everyone that race has traction, has purchase in the medieval period. There's a short book coming out too called England and the Jews, how religion and violence created the first racial state in the West. And that racial state is England, of course, you know. That's going to appear also with Cambridge. Both books are with Cambridge University Press. The short book is in a digital series on religion and violence. It's called an Elements series, I think. Both will come out early next year. The big book comes out February 28th next year. And I'm starting my 4th book called Early Globalities, The Interconnected World 500 to 1500 CE. It's being funded by an ACLS fellowship this year and is funded by a fellowship in Singapore in the Institute of South Asian Studies next year. So I hope to make real inroads, you know, into this book and not take 12 years to produce it. That's me.
That's you.
Yeah.
Well, and I have a question that might be first overly personal and 2 kind of prosaic, but I was wondering what sparked your interest in the first place in the Middle Ages?
Oh, it was very easy. I mean, I've been interested in the Arthurian legend for a very long time. So when I entered graduate school, the question I had was, why did the Arthurian legend survive for 900 years? Yeah, so it was a quest, yeah. And in the course of time, I conceptualized a definition for romance, for medieval romance, that it is a peculiar kind of narrational modality where history and fantasy collide each into the other at precisely the junctures where they can be mined to best advantage. So that medieval romance isn't purely a fantastical genre. It has history in it. It meets history head on. But what it does is it transmogrifies history, especially traumatic history, a history of atrocity, of problems, of trauma, horrific things, of conundrums. Transmogrifies it so that the audience receives it as pleasure, not pain. And it offers a sort of safe harbor in which to discuss certain things that are indiscussable. And that's why the Arthurian romance survived for so long, I thought, because I started working on this episode on Crusader cannibalism at Ma'ara Anuman in 1096 during the First Crusade, and the trauma suffered by Crusaders when they had ingested the infernal enemy and contaminated themselves. I saw the shock and the horror registered in the Latin chronicles of the First Crusade, the eyewitness chronicles, the chronicles written by chroniclers who accompanied the Crusaders, who were themselves Crusaders. And then I saw how it went underground and disappeared. But what kept surfacing again and again were these strange kinds of transmogrifications of the problem into in the direction of ever greater safety, until finally, a generation later, you got the King Arthur legend efflorescing for the first time in literature in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, in which King Arthur basically defeats a giant that reminds him of the giant of Mons Aravius, a cannibalistic giant. Mons Aravius, at that time, medievalists were saying this is probably Wales, because he's from Monmouth, probably Mount Snowdon or something. But then Mons Aravius in Latin, second declension masculine noun, is actually Arabian mountain. When you look at it that way, you start seeing all the place names everywhere in Geoffrey's text, Ali, Fatima, and kings and places, and so once you start reading that way, other things surface as well. So I wrote what became my first chapter of Empire of Magic, and thereafter everything just simply followed. Well, okay, I've got a romance, a chronicle romance. What other kinds of romances are there? Are there family romances and travel romances and chivalric romances? And what do you do with them? So that's what happened. I produced Empire of Magic, which is also a 533-page book. Yeah. But I am capable of writing shorter books. I'm going to be proving that.
Okay. Well, you answered some of my next question. I think a lot of us became interested in your work when we read the Eye on the World for Dr. Salisbury's travel class. And yeah, you speak about Mandeville. And you talked about how travel narration is used as a means of cultural domination. So I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that.
Sure. The thing about travel is that I think in order for travel narratives to work both today as well as in the medieval past, you have to retrieve not just the unfamiliar and the strange, right? I mean, when you're faced before the ineffable and something that for which you have absolutely no reference and no coordinates whatsoever, you don't know how to respond to it. The result is some kind of shock. What you always need is a kind of pattern between the familiar and the unfamiliar, so that you can process the unfamiliar. Yeah. So I think that's what Mandeville, the Mandeville author, does when showing you the strange, like the transmigration of souls into monkeys, for example, the long-nailed mandarin with the what, 10-inch or 15-inch nails, the idol at Coromandel, for which people flagellate themselves and kill their young, is always to give you some sense of home, So here's something unfamiliar. Here's how to think about it if you are from Europe, and this reminds you of such and such. So what then happens is that you get a set of thrilling particulars processed into narrative for you, so that the world, which seems full of the random, the chaotic, the frightening, gets transformed into something that is readily accessible to you, the audience at home. So, you know, it made sense when was I in Houston? I might have been in Houston, when I saw these Renaissance wonder boxes, where there were collections of all kinds of disparate objects from around the world kept in a cabinet. Yeah, and they're really the forebears of the museum. So this is what travel narratives are. They are like a museum in narrative form. They pick up all these things from around the world, artifacts from around the world. They process these artifacts into a story, into narratives, right? And then they deliver the world into the minds of the listening, reading audience at home in Europe. So it packages the world, and it takes the unfamiliar and turns it into the recreationally exotic. Yeah, exotic is a loaded word, right? It both has alterity in it as well as packaging into receptivity, so that it can be experienced as pleasurable and enjoyable rather than horrifying and strange. Yeah. So in that sense, the genre can be inherently, by virtue of its mechanism of operation, something that packages and delivers to you, and in the process works away, leaks out a certain kind of alterity and strangeness, and
So
about the world.
So if I understand correctly, basically, it's packaging it in such a way that the alterity is now
Delivered as a product.
Consumable.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Consumable and delivered as a product for which pleasure is derived. Yeah. I think that's the whole point about medieval romance, right? Why do we love them? We derive so much pleasure from them, and sometimes some of the things that they mention are so horrific, like cannibalism, right? Or like Richard Lionheart eating, like black natives, black Saracens.
Yeah.
We should be horrified, but entranced.
Entranced and almost.
Spellbound.
I laughed.
Yes, it's a joke too.
Yeah.
So,
That's a common response to that sort of thing, because there's a genre of American traditional murder ballads,
yes.
and often when they're performed, like there's some act of horrific violence, like someone kills someone and throw them in a river, and often when they're performed for an audience, the audience laughs, because like there's this response where you want to turn horror into humor.
And a number of steps is involved before the cannibalism can be turned into a joke in Coeur de Lion.
Yeah. I think you've answered most of my next questions. In the postscript to the Empire of Magic, which was written after 9/11, you talk about analogies between creation of race today and creation of race in the Middle Ages. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking about that here.
Sure. The thing about contemporary race that reminds me of the European past is how the definitive factor seems to be religion. I think critical race theory, and certainly canonical race theory, theorizes race particularly well from between the high modern era of race, the 18th century, to about the mid-20th century, and fingers science as the criterion, the culprit, issuing forth all the different kinds of dispensations of the racial, so to speak. Yeah, but the magisterial discourse of the Middle Ages is religion, not science. So it helped me arrive at a working definition, a working hypothesis, a minimal working hypothesis of race, that it is a mechanism of sorting in which differences are selectively assigned and then strategically and selectively essentialized in order to mark off different populations and groups as absolutely and fundamentally different in various ways. So it can be through skin color, but it can also be not just through epidermal race, but it can also be through their cultural practices, their habits, it can be through their religion, it can be through environment, climate, through any number of ways. So race becomes then not something that has content, something that is a sorting mechanism rather than a content. But the key terms for me are absolutely and fundamentally different? How do you define a people as absolutely and fundamentally different? Which is how Muslims are being defined today, for example, and sometimes Jews as well. You know, you see anti-Semitism is on the rise again. In the medieval period, certainly Jews were defined in this sort of way as absolutely and fundamentally different. And there were all kinds of markers used. There were biomarkers, like they were thought to have horns or a tail, and of course there were phenotypes, their noses, their brows, right? And there were cultural markers like the badge, like the laws that worked upon them. There were theories that Jewish men menstruated like women, either once a month or once a year during Passion Week. There was a need for blood, therefore they ritually killed Christian boys and for their blood to use in Passover rituals, or to use because they congenitally needed blood, or they had a special smell, a stench that marked them, or there was this, there was that, there was all sorts of things, right? And if you don't call this racial, what do you call it? A lot of the things that happened in the Middle Ages, European Middle Ages, these phenomena, these institutions and laws, if they were to happen in the modern era, we would have no difficulty seeing that these were racial. These are racial. This is racial treatment. The herding and the tagging, you know, the segregation orders, the targeting, the lies told about them, not just about individual families or persons, but a whole collectivity, a whole group of people. It's defined in one way and one way only, as a homogeneous population of child killers, counterfeiters, liars, thieves, and so on. So, I mean, these things, if they were transferred to a later era, would be racial. So why are we so afraid to use the kinds of terms and the tools and the resources that we would have if we were willing to say this is race, right? Without those tools and those resources, those categories of thought and argument, you know, we destigmatize some of the atrocities of the medieval period. And, you know, I don't think it serves just as well to say that, well, these are forms of otherness or difference. These are categories of greater generality than race. Just to say that, you know, this is xenophobia, or this is fear of otherness and fear of difference. These are categories of great generality and sometimes greater benignity than to say these were acts of racism. Yeah. Race has a certain kind of weight for us. You know, we retain it for all the strategic values and the epistemological values that we have assigned to it over the years, and we know what it means when we say this behavior is racial behavior or racist behavior. You know, it carries a kind of gravity and seriousness that to say, well, this is just otherness and difference does not. You know, yeah.
So, yeah, and I've noticed that you don't really talk about othering, or I haven't found you talking about othering. This is why.
Yeah, not as much. Not as much. It's a general term. It's useful in some respects, but it can make us too comfortable. You know. Yeah. And today you see religious race on the rise again. People being defined not just in terms of their skin color and their phenotypes, but in terms of their cultural habits, their religious subscriptions, their beliefs, their convictions, what kind of clothing they wear, and so on. Yeah. It's funny how medieval and modern periods touch in these kinds of institutions. Yeah. The database, you remember during the 2016 election, one of the two candidates suggested that we create a database for identifying Muslims in the United States, all of them, you know. Well, the Jewish exchequer, the exchequer of the Jews in medieval England, was a database collecting information on where Jews lived, what their livelihoods were, you know, what their habits were, what their assets were, and tracked them through this particular medieval database. It got to a point where the Statute of Jewry in 1270 said that they could not live in towns unless there was an Arca test that was there to track their behavior. And they could not have Christians and Jews living together, going to sleep and waking up in the same place. It's kind of a
So I guess I've been, I guess, fascinated because you have done a lot with, I guess, you know, the global Middle Ages as a concept of website I've been looking at. And so one of the, I guess, this question comes partially because I teach an introductory class to the Middle Ages, and so the question is, when is the Middle Ages? And we often go by, at least starting point, with the fall of Rome. I would try to complicate that by talking about the crisis of the 3rd century, or how later barbarian rulers try to use Romanitas and that sort of thing. But I was interested in this global Middle Ages. How does that change when we define the Middle Ages or what we define the Middle Ages as? Because other regions have other ways of traditionally counting history. So, for example, if we're going to integrate, Central Asian or Chinese history with our sort of traditional medieval sphere, which is basically Europe plus the Mediterranean, maybe, you have things like, the Han, if we're going to do like traditional political history,
yes,
the Han Dynasty falls around 200 CE, and the Sui doesn't come around to the 600s. So again, I know
You're a global medievalist.
What?
You're a global medievalist.
I'm a bit of, just a teensy bit of a cinephile, but, or I took some Chinese history classes in undergrad, but I guess, I'm sorry I'm going with all these really political history constructs talking about dynasties and stuff.
Yes.
But the question is if we're trying to frame when is the Middle Ages, how does the global Middle Ages affect that? Because we can't just point to those political dynastic constructs and say this is the fall of the Roman Empire, this is the fall of the Han.
This is an excellent question. This is an excellent question. It's precisely a question that problematizes our understanding of what the Middle Ages is. So my colleague and co-director, Susan Noakes at the University of Minnesota, never says Middle Ages or European Middle Ages without putting that into quotes, obviously the factitiousness of our timeline draws attention to itself. We say, well, we know that the Middle Ages is a Renaissance construct. It's a construct of Renaissance historiographers to name an interval between 2 ages of glorified empire and of authenticity and authority, right? Greco-Roman antiquity and its Renaissance, right? So we know that this is a spurious construct. It's a convenient heuristic for us more than anything else. So we say, okay, let's just say 500 to 1500. So that's 1,000 years, right? End of the Roman Empire, beginning of the Renaissance. And we know history doesn't work like this. It's got jagged edges. It doesn't say, okay, we are now in the year 500. New Age has begun. This is 501. But and in fact, a graduate student once said, why don't we call it the 1001 Years Project? It's such a cool, colorful sort of naming. But all historians said, no, that sounds too much like fantasy to us. It sounds like, you literature guys like it, we don't like this. It sounds like it's not historical enough. So we said, okay, after lots and lots of conversing on this in fall of 2007, we said, okay, let's call it the Global Middle Ages Project, even though some of us don't believe that the Middle Ages is a fixed term or a real period or whatever it was. We can't call it early global pre-modernity. That just sounds like a mess. What is pre-modernity? Biblical time is pre-modern. So, but you're right. So what we generally do is we try not to name other people's periods for them as medieval. So we don't say medieval China or medieval India or medieval Japan. But what we are seeing is that Japanologists, sinologists, Indologists are using the term medieval themselves to describe certain periods of time in the historiography of their field and their area. So, and of course the timeline is always different in each place, right? We don't know whether that's because the word medieval has so much hegemony because of European studies in the academy that they are using the word medieval for convenience, or maybe they are using it because it makes some sort of historical sense for them to name some interval between what they see as a classical period and what they see as a modern period. But global time for us beautifully complicates our understanding of the European Middle Ages and of all temporalities for that matter. If you're a bit of a sinologist, my favorite examples are from China, because pre-modernity in China sometimes looks a lot like modernity in other parts of the world. Like in 11th century Song China, my favorite example, the data of Robert Hartwell, the Harvard historian, his archive is still at Harvard, show us that the amount of iron and coal that was burned for the iron and steel industries in Song Dynasty China is about 70% of the iron and coal burned in industrial Great Britain at the beginning of the 18th century for the same industries. So what does it mean to say that the Industrial Revolution began in the West, or that there was only one Industrial Revolution, right? It basically elicits from us an understanding that there were many industrial revolutions. Some countries did not build on them for various contingent reasons to do with their own history. In China's case, it's the history of constant disruption, political and social disruption because of nomad invasions, constant warfare. Right now, the book I'm working on has 3 or 4 parts, and one part involves a 9th century Tang era Arab dhow. This Arab dhow was on its way back from Hangzhou in China, on its way back to the Abbasid Empire, after having sold its cargo, unloaded its cargo, and it filled its holds with 70,000 ceramics, with designs favored in the export market, not locally. These are mass produced. We're not talking cottage industries here. You know, these were mass produced industrially in famous kilns in China. In the Tang era. In the Tang era, we're talking about the Tang era. On its way back, it sank off an island in Indonesia called Belitung, and 55,000 artifacts have survived. They are housed in the Asia Civilizations Museum in Singapore, where I will be in January looking at them. So there's other things as well. There's gold and silver, and there's just amazing things in this treasure trove. But there are examples of the earliest blue and white pottery, Chinese pottery ever seen, 200 years earlier than blue and white, then traditionally we know blue and white to have emerged. And they bear designs that are Iranian. They are Iranian lozenges, you know, and they are clearly experimental. They're prototypes. They are not perfected, they look crude, and you can see they're trying to figure out how to do blue and white. And then blue and white disappears for a while, until 200 years later. So we see globality. You know, there are stories of globalism to be told here, early globalism to be told here. And there are stories of early industrialization in China. So, you know, there are all these markers of modernity already in Tang Dynasty China, you know, that will later become markers of modernity for the West when they talk about modern time, modern industrial time, 18th century time, 19th century time, and so on, right? If you look at Marco Polo, Le Déguisement du Monde, Polo Rustichello say that the Mongols had a state-of-the-art postal system that they inherited obviously from the Chinese, from earlier Chinese dynasties, but they systematized and routinized it by breaking it down into reliable constituent parts that ensured speed of travel and of communication. That looks a lot like modernity. They had a surveillance system where they trained the population in the big cities like Hangzhou to internalize surveillance and to report on demographics, household by household, hostelry by hostelry. That looks a lot also like the modern. There were so many things that the Mongols did that looked like modernity, even the universalization of paper money. They had paper money from the Chinese, they got that from the Chinese. But the way they were able to universalize it across Pax Mongolica was really quite astonishing, and required power, it required empires. But there are already all the signs of what the modern would look like, you know. So it really does, global time really does complicate our understanding of what these temporalities are. I'm glad you're complicating them too.
Thanks.
Yeah.
There's another question, I guess it's a similar vein, is I was going through the various projects on the Global Middle Ages website, and I noticed one of them was about the Mississippian period in American archaeology.
That is the most popular site.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean...
It has led me to this broader question,
yes,
because it's fascinating how, for one thing, Americans often like to say in comparison to Europeans is we don't have as much history, sort of ignoring everything that happened before 1492, but there's also this, like, if you look at American history, there's this fascination with, like, trying to import the European Middle Ages, like the cloisters in New York,
Yes.
or building houses that are reminiscent of castles or other sort of European architecture. So I'm wondering, like, I was also interested because sometimes when people talk about do sort of similar stuff along the lines of the global Middle Ages, there's a focus, I guess, either on, like, the Mediterranean system, which brings in Middle East and North Africa and Europe, or more like the steppe sort of Central Asian connection between Europe and Asia. But what's interesting is, like, how does America fit into the Middle Ages in this sort of project?
So this is a good question, and this is a question for Tim Palkitat.
Well, yeah, so I didn't want to get too far into, like, the specifics of that particular article because I know it's a different person, but I guess it brought up the general question is, how does America fit into the global Middle Ages, and how does that change how we think about our own history?
Okay,
like
this is another very good question. First of all, I must tell you that Tim's site is the most visited site. I just got these statistics from our webmaster, and his is way by far the project that most people are interested in. So Tim, if you are watching this, I'd like you to keep working on that project, please, and advancing it. He calls it the North American Middle Ages. I do not. I mean, it would be presumptuous of me to. But Tim calls himself a medievalist. He's a Native Americanist, and he works on Cahokia in particular, the Mississippi region. But he calls it the North American Middle Ages. The way he works it is he's interested in the relations across the North America and North and Central America, basically. So for him, this is his panorama is across the continent. What I do, what I'm doing, chapter 5 of my book, Invention of Race in European Middle Ages, is to discuss the Vinland Sagas and the expeditions to the Americas, and what the consequences of that mean. I mean, firstly, it's not absolutely clear that the expeditioners, the settlers, colonists, whatever you want to call them, were aware this is a new continent. You know, I mean, if you know anything about Icelanders or about the Norse, this is how they colonize and settle. Somebody sites land somewhere, eventually somebody gets outlawed, he brings his followers and his relatives to that new land, and Iceland is founded, or Greenland is founded, and then Vinland gets founded. You know? It's Norse style, Icelandic style colonization, settler colonialism we will call it today. What happens is, what happens in the sagas, which were set down 200 years perhaps after the original events, is that the sagas are interestingly backed and supported by excavation and archaeological evidence. You know, if you know about the excavations at Lawns Meadows in Newfoundland, in Canada, there's been a great deal of work done now, and the excavations have revealed that there was a lot of navigation, circumpolar navigation, from very early onwards. We don't know how early as the 10th century, perhaps earlier, all the way through until, you know, the Little Ice Age closes in on toward the end of what we call the European Middle Ages. So Dorset artifacts have been found in Iceland. So, you know, Native American artifacts have been found in Iceland, and, you know, of course, all kinds of artifacts have been found at Lawns Meadows in Newfoundland. So I'm very, very interested in this process. So I discuss the Vinland Sagas, which are literature, but, you know, sagas are a peculiar modality of narration, right? With a lot of historical evidence in them, mixed with memory and with genealogies and family and individual biographies and so on. I discuss this in relation to the excavations and the archaeological evidence. If you are on www.globalmiddleages.org and you click on the Discoveries of the Americas project, it will lead you to a bibliography of essays and texts about the so-called discoveries of the Americas, and you will find among these an article or two written by scientists that have discovered a gene element, a genetic element, a DNA element called C1e. that is possessed only by people in Iceland and Native Americans, and by nobody else in the world. So they are very cautious. This is a group of scientists, you know. I cannot understand most of what they're saying because their methods are beyond my ken. But they're very cautious about their conclusions. But one of the things they say is that we have to conclude that at some point a woman, they think it's a woman, traveled back, at least one Native American woman traveled back to Iceland. The Vinland Sagas, Erik Saga Rauda actually says that 2 native boys were kidnapped, abducted, they don't say kidnapped, right, were abducted and taken back to Iceland. They were taught language, meaning Old Norse, and they were Christianized, and they reported on their home societies. I don't know if 2 native boys were taken back. You know, the thing about cultural memories 200 years down the line is what gets retained is what people want to remember and feel is important to remember. But absolute details, small details may not be right. Were there 2? Were there more? Were there boys? Were there girls? We don't know, right? But somebody got brought back and reproduced, right? And down the line, there is a strange genetic strain that cannot be accounted for unless you take the sagas into consideration. There are other things as well. For instance, there is a group of Paleo-Eskimos with no descendants, and there's never been an adequate explanation for how they and why they disappeared. Most theories say, well, the logical thing is to assume that incoming groups of Paleo-Eskimos drove out this group or made them extinct or intermarried with them and assimilated them or whatever it is. But I thought, why not zoonotic disease? You know, because in both the sagas, both the Vinland sagas, animals were brought along with the expeditioners. We don't know what kinds of animals. We know there were milk-bearing animals because milk is discussed in one of the sagas. We know there was a bull because there's a bellowing bull in both the sagas. And maybe, who knows, there may have been vermin stored away. Rats are always on board ships. Yeah, there may have been cockroaches. We don't know what kinds of animals there were. And all it takes is for some to have been left behind or to have gone wild, perhaps, for us to understand that, well, zoonotic disease transfers readily to humans. You think of avian flu, swine flu, you think of AIDS, for that matter, right? The membrane between the animal and the human seems to be crossed readily by viruses and by bacteria that simply adjust and adapt. So this is pre-Columbus. The Native Americans were fortunate that smallpox, chickenpox, all these common diseases did not reach Iceland till very late. So they did not seem to have brought human disease to wipe out native populations. But perhaps there was zoonotic disease, you know, that affected the Native Americans they encountered. And we don't know what particular tribes of Native Americans they encountered. We can only speculate, or we can argue based on who inhabited what kinds of regions in the time period. And even the regions are contested. You know, that we don't know how far south these expeditions traveled. For instance, some people think they came all the way to Boston. Most people think they probably did not go further south than Nova Scotia. Yeah. So again, you know, but there are these windows that open onto globality that we don't think about. If we think about it, there was a period called the medieval warm period around the 10th, 11th centuries, when during the summer it was warm enough to make the voyaging across the Atlantic. So much so that during the summer, if you read the sagas carefully, they'll say over and over again, even when they realized they had to leave their settlements because they were outnumbered by Native Americans, war had begun, they had to leave, they never actually leave until summer comes. They wait until summer and then they cross, because that's the only time that the Atlantic is navigable. So there was a time period when there was a fair amount of voyaging, until, of course, the little ice age closes in toward the end of the European Middle Ages. Now, the medieval warm period did not affect all of Europe the same way. My colleague, Astrid Ogilvie, at the University of Colorado, works in a lab called INSTAR, where she works on polar climate change and polar climate conditions today. She's an Icelandic Sagas specialist by training. Medievalists are everywhere, you know, and they have many kinds of lives after their training. And she always likes to remind us that the northern Northern Europe was impacted much more than the Mediterranean, for example, by climate change, by window that discloses to us how climate affects human exchange and human possibility and even human settlements, right? And then later, even Greenland gets abandoned during the Little Ice Age because they couldn't make it work and they left it till the Inuit. Yeah. But you know, this is what early globalism looks like. It's very curious and it's very interesting. Obviously, this facilitated the fur trade tremendously because in both the sagas, the trade exchanges that take place always results in the Icelanders receiving skins and pelts and furs because that's what they want.
Yeah.
That is a valuable resource and commodity on the international market. They have access to the international markets. By the time they return to Europe, they always go to Norway first, where they unload their goods, and then they are rich, and then they go create homesteads elsewhere and so on. So this was obviously important for commodity trading of furs and the fur trade. Yeah, in the early Middle Ages, I guess the High Middle Ages, High or Central Middle Ages, depending on how to define that. Yeah. That's how I think of how North America fits into the globalism of the rest of the world. Australia is different though. It's out of it. I don't know how that would work. You need to talk to our Australian colleagues. There is a Global Middle Ages research group now based in Sydney, started at Sydney, but it's pan-Australian. And they are interested in the Polynesian connections with Austroasia, you know, with Indonesia, the Philippines, the Malay archipelago, the Indonesian archipelago. Yeah. But it's early days yet. They got formed only last year in 2016, and I don't know what they're doing right now because I'm not in conversation with them for the last few months. Yeah.
So I guess this is a master's program.
Yes.
And there's no PhD here.
Yes.
So some of us will be going on to PhD programs.
Yes.
And some of us will be doing other things. And I guess we want to ask about PhD programs or about other things.
It's your question.
So what kind of advice can you give us in terms of applying for PhD programs? What do we need to do to be attractive as PhD candidates? And
you know, a lot is going to depend upon your fields. Some of you are literature specialists, some of you are history specialists, some of you are language specialists. You're going to be looking at a lot of different universities with very different PhD programs, right? So the thing to remember is every university is going to get well over 100 applications. Some universities will get hundreds of applications. So your statement of purpose needs to stand out. It cannot be an I love literature statement of purpose. You know, I mean, when I was a graduate student, one of the first things Jonathan Cullett said to us, you know, at a coffee, he said, all the applications that said I love literature, I put them aside. We said, oh wow, we're so glad we didn't say that. So, you know, I love literature, I love history, not in that. I mean, basically, I think the more concrete you are, the better the application looks. Like the statement looks best if you say, there are these 3 or 4 conundrums I have, and I have these particular questions I'm following. I cannot begin even to know how to answer these questions unless I'm in a PhD program and I have the training, you know. And we are almost all of us driven by questions, right? Research questions, teaching questions, all kinds of questions. So I think it'd be useful to find ways to make your application stand out. Bear in mind, these people are reading until they're exhausted into the night, you know. They will give you a certain amount of attention. So I would suggest something that I told my son very early when he was maybe in middle school, and he has never forgotten since, because now today he's a professional speechwriter in New York. I said, your first paragraph needs to get attention. Once you've got their attention, then you can elaborate and explain. But if you haven't got their attention in your first paragraph, you're going to lose them. Your last paragraph should leave them wanting more. Make them feel that, well, this is an interesting person. Let's go on to the next stage with her and see what happens. You know, yeah. That's and of course, make sure that your letters of recommendation are absolutely enthusiastic and say all the right things. You know, letters of recommendation, if professors who understand the genre they're not meant to be like news articles. On the one hand, these people say this, but on the other hand, there is this. There should be no on the other hand, right? Yeah, yeah. They should be 150% behind you. Yeah, that's much more important than their rank. You know, we have read wonderful letters by assistant professors who really knew how to craft a support letter. Yeah, and we have read tepid letters from endowed chairs who really, you know, are very busy and write a lot of letters and, you know, are just going through it because they have to go through the process.
Okay.
Yeah. Take the GRE several times if necessary. That always matters. Yeah.
All right.
Other than that, you know, just have interesting potential future projects you want to work on. Obviously, you're coming in as an entering student. They understand that your directions will change. They understand that depending on what you are taught, what you encounter, your interests will change. But they want people who are interesting and who look like, you know, they have a lot of potential for the future.
So, Guthrie, you had career questions as well.
Okay, career questions.
So yeah, this is, I guess, more of the generally, I guess, a career, more themed stuff than scholarship. So one of the questions I had is about the writing process, because I noticed is that often when fiction writers get interviewed, like one of the standard questions they get asked is about the process, and not so much with scholarly writers, although it happens. So like, how do you actually look at it about putting the words on the page, or do you have any advice about, you know, a good way to go about, you know, the actual process of writing something?
You know, this works differently for different people, obviously, right? They all have different habits. I've had friends who just sit down and from the first word to the last word, it just all comes out beautifully, beautifully written, organized, in prose, and their thoughts are logical and progressive. Mine are not obviously like that. Sometimes it depends. It begins differently. Sometimes it starts for me with a title. Once I have a title, I know what I'm going to do. Sometimes it begins with like a last line. Yeah, and that is another story. Okay, then I kind of like, I now want to tell the story. You know, I also have a word hoard. Basically, I collect favorite words and phrases and things, right? So I try a lot for feminine metaphors, like stitching things together. This is not just woven together, but it's stitched together in this way, or this is the seam between this and this, because, you know, some of us sew, right? Or knots that interknotted in an interknotted cluster way. Some of us like to make knots. And once I read something that Su Fang had written, but she said fanned out. I said, oh God, what a glorious image. So I collect metaphors, I collect words, I collect things that I like. And then I make notes. I make notes when I teach. If someone says something interesting, I make little notes and remind myself to work on it later. So I collect piles of notes. Then I organize my piles of notes into paragraphs. Sometimes a particular thought is interesting and I might write an argument on it for a while, but I don't know what's going to happen with it. And then when you actually sit down and do the dog's body work of actual writing, it's always hard, right? I go through all my notes and refresh my mind as to what it was that struck me that was interesting and that I want to say. And then I try to organize, you know. I make a roadmap of where I want to go. Stage 1 here, stage 2 here, stage 3 here, stage 4 here. Then I try and fill out the steps along the way. And then some of these steps will fill out faster, some later. Some of the interconnections will not work, and then I rewrite those later. But really, it's a process of filling out. It's a filling out process until I get something that looks like a full kind of body. Then I try and make it look like a coherent narrative, and I go through more than one draft. This is something that I have a niece who has a debut novel coming out this summer. She sold it for 6 figures on both sides of the Atlantic, in the UK and the US, both top publishers. Thomas Holt here in the US, and can't remember the name of the UK publisher, as well as in 6 other countries in 6 different languages in Europe. And Zoe Saldana wants to play the lead character. And Amazon and Netflix are talking about making it into a series. It's called Suicide Club. And she writes in that way as well. She's a creative writer, but she she sits down and makes a kitchen list, a laundry list of like possible beginnings. Character sits in the kitchen, reminisces about her birth, or character does this and so on. And then she does, and then whatever, she tries to flesh it out. So if I go in this direction, talks about her birth, what do I get, right? If I go in that direction and she's in a restaurant, what do I get? Can I have an incident coming that's interesting? Does something happen? And so on. So it's basically the her answer when people ask her, how do you write, is you just sit down and you write. You just have to begin, It's not conceptualizing it and so on is pleasurable. And it's fun, but it doesn't actually get the writing done. You just basically have to sit down and start writing and see what happens. And sometimes you have better days because you've slept well, you've eaten well, you're on a high. And sometimes you have worse days because you're tired and your mind doesn't work well. Yeah, but the writing needs to get done, and I think that's very important to do if you are going to stay in the academy and in this profession. Is not writing is not a forgivable. It's not a forgivable thing. You must always write. Always expect to write, always expect to get work out. If you consistently cannot meet deadlines and you consistently cannot write, that is not a good habit to have. Yeah. Although publishers will understand that academics are always behind time. Yeah, always. Yeah.
That's good to hear.
Always behind time. But you should not. You should try and get into the habit of trying to meet deadlines as early as possible. Some of us got to these bad habits, and they're always asking for forgiveness. Asking for forgiveness is really not a good place to be in. Yeah. But
that's excellent advice.
Really?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Just keep doing it until you make it. I used to find it much harder to write when I was younger. When I was a graduate student, writing took forever. It took me 6 months to write my first PMLA article, and it took me 6 months to write Cannibalism, the First Crusade, and the Genesis of Medieval Romance. I can get through things much faster now. That quality and that level of article, well, okay, the psychoanalysis and deconstruction and feminism was hard, but the cannibalism article, given the archive that I had and the historical information I had amassed, I can write that in 3 months now. So it gets easier as you go along. Everything gets easier as you go along.
Is it because you know more, or?
You just get into the habit of writing. I think it's more like habit, The more you do something, the more familiar it is, the easier it becomes. Your mind just begins to work in certain ways and to produce words in certain ways. Giving a paper for the first time is hard, right? At a conference, you are self-conscious. You wonder, if I make this joke, will they laugh, or will they think, oh my God, she's terrible, And then people will remember, because in my case, I was the only person of color in the room. They will remember, So it's hard when you first begin, but there comes a time when you feel comfortable standing up and being yourself. Not gesturing too much and looking like a wild woman, right? But today I figure this is me. If they don't like it, they don't like it. What can I do? So you just practice makes for ease. And the same with writing. Just keep writing, and then it gets easier and you get more prolific with time too. Yeah. Don't avoid thinking I have to have the perfect sentence. It's come out exactly right, otherwise I can't continue. This is not going to be good. Except that there will be drafts. For most of us, that there will be more than one draft. And then there will come a draft that you will halfway like. Yeah.
Or the deadline arrives and you turn it
down. Right, that's true. I mean, perfection is for the gods. It's not for us. Yeah. You just have to let it go at some point. You have to accept that the index is not perfect. There will be typos. Some reviewer will point out typos on this page, that page that you've missed, or you spelled the same name 2 different ways twice because he has noticed it and you have not. You just have to accept that and let it go and not let it ruin your life. Yeah.
Okay. So, I had 2 more questions. One of them was about those of us who are not going on to a PhD. What kind of advice would you have for that?
We had a little conversation about this
we did.
Last night. Not going on to a PhD. Everybody needs a master's degree these days. You can do all kinds of things. You can go into publishing. You can go, that includes university presses. You can go into journalism or the media. There's always the teaching profession. You could go into speech writing, and these are just or translation. These are just the professions that use language. The thing about an advanced degree, like a master's or a PhD, is it trains certain habits of mind and of discipline, and employers understand that. I was told by one of my savviest undergraduates that one of the reasons why employers like people to have college degrees in the first place is not so much that they are vocationally trained to do a certain type of job, because a college education isn't job training. It's because an employer likes to know you had the discipline and the maturity and the self-composure to complete your college education. Yeah, so they understand that the process of an advanced degree registers a person capable of certain kinds of analytical thinking, a capacity for critical thought and for analysis, as well as for synthesis. Someone who can organize thoughts, can organize words, resources, materials, tables, statistics, data, resources of any kind, right? People who are capable of advanced levels of thought, of interrogation, of imagination, of envisioning, of visualizing, and then who have flexible minds. And that can be put to any kind of use. My brother-in-law once said that McKinsey and Company, he worked for McKinsey for a number of years, liked English PhDs. And they're a business consultancy, and they work for governments as well as corporations. So why would they want English PhDs? They said, well, they have good minds. They tend to have good minds and good imaginations. So employers tend to look for people who are thinking outside the box, and if you come from a field that is not their field, you usually think outside the box, and you will see things they do not see. Yeah. So, these days people are always asking why a liberal arts education, why humanities education, right? Because it's not job training. And I think it's very important that it's not job training. Job training trains you narrowly for a job, and we really don't know what the jobs are going to be in the 21st century. All kinds of new jobs are appearing all the time that we would never have dreamed of before, right? So I think what a humanities education does, and certainly what an advanced degree does, it trains the flexible mind. Yeah, it trains a mind that is flexible and nimble and capable of envisioning and of imagination, as well as of all the processes of thought, analysis, synthesis, argument, organization, and so on. Yeah, not possible to predict what you will do with a master's. Yeah, okay. But interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, and then my last question is, and I'm going to use air quotes like your colleague does. Since Guthrie mentioned that we are all teaching, and my question is, how do we get undergraduates interested in the Middle Ages? How do we get them excited about that?
It's usually not hard to get undergraduates excited about the Middle Ages. They usually come with a kind of romanticized idea of the Middle Ages. Knights in shining armor and ladies in billowing dresses already anyway, right? Or they have seen one of the versions of Robin Hood, or one of the versions of the King Arthur story, or Excalibur, or something. What I found hard is I admire my colleagues who teach Dante, for instance. I don't know how to make Dante interesting to an undergraduate, but everything else, they love the Middle Ages. They may come with preconceived notions that they think they know what the Crusades are, until they see how complicated it is when you actually teach them economic reasons, political reasons, non-faith related reasons, demographic reasons, and so on, what these were like, and also all the randomness and chance, the sheer accidents that happened along the way. It's not hard to keep their interest. I don't find it difficult at all. I mean, they love the stories of adventure. When I teach medieval travel, they usually love Sunjata above everything else. This is the Epic of Mali, probably written down, well, I don't know when it was written down exactly, it's a complicated matter. But it's how the Empire of Mali was created. And this was an empire that at its height was 2,000 miles across and maybe 600 miles, north to south. And, Mali, as well as Songhai, as well as the trans-Saharan trade, furnished maybe 70% of the gold in medieval Europe throughout the European Middle Ages. So undergraduates love the fascination of the untold story. They didn't realize this, and they didn't realize Africa had kingdoms and empires and cities and states, and some of it looks very similar to the kinds of chivalry that they are familiar with and heroic values that they're familiar with. And the stories have quest narratives, the stories have travel, women and children in exile, recognition of the hero, you know, and his greatness, his future greatness, the role of sorcery and magic, the role of women, you know, soothsayers and all kinds of things until they encounter these literatures. So just about anything can be made interesting, although I really admire my colleagues who teach Dante, because I don't know how to make Dante interesting, but everything else. And these days there are all these multimedia accompaniments, right? Like Canterbury Tales and the Decameron. There's Pasolini has the Canterbury Tales and the Decameron. You can always screen movies. I like to screen Lady Hawk when I teach medieval romance, yeah, to see what is and what isn't medieval. I've even used clips from Conan the Barbarian to show them what's not medieval. Okay, lone hero in the Middle Ages would have been dead in a week. You know, that basically identity is relational. Survival depends upon the group and having, you know, like the comitatus and allies and so on. Otherwise, you can't be one man fighting alone. You don't survive. There's so many ways to inculcate the Middle Ages now. There's Game of Thrones, which some of my graduate students like to use.
I've used Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones, yeah. There's digital games like Assassin's Creed. Yeah. There's all kinds of things. Yeah. I think it's not hard to enthuse undergraduates about the Middle Ages. What is more interesting is complicating the Middle Ages for them, so they don't think it's a simple ages of faith. You know, there were no heresies. Everybody believed the one same thing.
Yeah.
There were no heresies. Heretics were not burned, persecuted, or anything. You know, some of their opinions today, the things that they believe in their particular faith, if they are Southern Baptists or they were Protestant or Methodists, put them back in the Middle Ages. Your students will be among those who are being burnt at the stake and who are being interrogated and tortured. And when they realize that it's interesting for them, it complicates their ideas of the simple ages of faith. Or when they learn, for example, that medieval knights, whom they are used to think of as, thanks to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and Tennyson and others, whom they are used to think of as men in shining armor who are noble, when they read stories in which they rape peasant women, you know, and they despise anyone who is not elite, or despise the peasantry, and you realize the peasantry is going to be the majority of people during the European Middle Ages, including their families if they had been there. That complicates their understanding too. Or when they see the murders of the Crusades, when they read the Crusade Chronicles, like Raymond d'Aguilleur or Fouquier of Chartres, saying the horses, we waded knee deep in blood in Jerusalem, the massacres. You know, we killed so many men, women, children, you know, that we waded, some say ankle deep in blood, some say knee deep in blood, you know, through the city. And then we depopulated the city and repopulated with our own people. And we were successful, we conquered. And the piles of bodies were as tall as buildings outside the city, and they gave off this terrible stench. Then you realize something about the cost of war and what's involved in war. You know, when women, children, the old are killed simply because they were there. You know, they were there, and they had homes for the taking. And now other people wanted their homes and would occupy them and would grow rich at their expense. Yeah. So I think what's interesting is when they get the aha moment. You know, it's like, okay, it's not as simple as I thought it was. In some ways, some of the habits and practices are similar to some of our habits and practices today, and which makes us rethink anew our habits and practices as well. Yeah. What was a great pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank you so
thanks
much.
you so much
I really
for
enjoyed
agreeing
it so much.
to sit down with us for this.
I really enjoyed. My favorite time of visiting campuses is when I get to talk to students. I've done this. As I was telling Christine, I've done 4 talks in 4 weeks. This is not the 4th week.
Oh dear.
Different parts of the country. And the best moments have always been when I sit down in a conversation with graduate students. Yeah. And you're representing the ones who cannot be here. So it's a great pleasure.
Yeah, we appreciate it. We really do.